Grade 10s. This is your lesson on In Flanders Fields, a poem by John McCrae. If you read here, you'll learn In Flanders Fields is a rondeau. That's a particular form of poem written by the Canadian poet, soldier, and physician John McCrae. The fact that he was a physician means that not only did he fight in the war, but he also treated a lot of the soldiers with when they were wounded. So he wrote this poem in 1915 as a memorial to those who died in a World War I battle fought in the region of Belgium known as Ypres Salient. McCrae himself treated many of the soldiers injured in the battle and was particularly moved by the death of a close friend, Alexis Helmer. The poem describes the tragedy of the soldiers' deaths as well as the ongoing natural beauty that surrounds their graves. It also addresses the question of the next generation's responsibility to carry on the soldiers' battle. So we've already looked at Anthem for Doomed Youth, and we've also looked at Dulce Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, both of them. So now we're going to look at a different kind of World War I poem. So let's read it quickly. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Okay, so the summary, to read the summary quickly, the speaker describes the poppies, beautiful red flowers that grow in a place called Flanders Fields. It is because of all of the poppies that grow in Flanders Fields that the poppy has become a symbol of remembering all the soldiers who died in World War I. Still today, you'll see on the day of the year where we remember the soldiers who died in World War I, D-Day. You will see everybody who wishes to show that they're remembering those soldiers wearing a red poppy on their collar or on their shirt. Along with the poppies, there are rows of crosses, white crosses marking graves throughout the fields. The speaker also notes that larks, a particular kind of bird, fly high above the fields, singing their songs. A lark is supposedly the bird that, when you hear it singing, it is the bird that announces the morning. So in a lot of literature, Shakespeare also mentions larks when he wants to show that the larks are singing means that it's morning time. Nightingale singing means that it's the beginning of nighttime. So that is what a lark represents, is the beginning of a new day. I also just want to show you a picture of Flanders fields. So you can have the image in your mind. So that's what the fields look like. Okay, with so many poppies, apparently they grow there so well because of all the soldiers' bodies that are in the ground. Here we go. There are all the graves. All right. So, the next line is, however, the birds' songs can barely be heard on the ground below because the noise of the guns, most likely from some kind of battle, well, obviously from some kind of battle, is too loud. Okay, so you have to really listen if you want to hear the birds singing. The speaker then reveals that he is one of many speakers. He's not just I, he's we. And also, he reveals that they are dead. So, in other words, they're speaking from the other side, they're speaking from the afterlife. So, the speakers in this poem are soldiers who have already died in battle and probably died in this location. Until recently, the speakers were alive, experiencing the beauties of sunrise and sunset, as well as loving relationships with other people. And now the speakers are dead and buried in Flanders fields. The speakers go on to ask the reader to continue their fight now that they are dead and can no longer do so. They liken their struggle to a torch that they are now passing on to the people who are still alive because they themselves cannot hold it anymore. They ask the reader to take this responsibility seriously, in fact, not even asking, more commanding the readers to take this responsibility onto their own shoulders. The speakers conclude by saying that if the reader betrays the speakers by not continuing their fight, then the speaker will never be peaceful in death. And there is a kind of a hidden threat there that the reader will then be haunted by the ghosts of the dead soldiers if they don't take on this responsibility to carry on the fight. And even though the field where they lie is covered in beautiful flowers, this does not take away the responsibility that the speakers insist now belongs to the living reader who is reading this poem. Okay, so you can tell already that this is a very, very different poem from the one that, the two that we have read already. So the first theme we're going to look at is the theme of life, death, and nature. In the poem In Flanders Fields, the speaker describes the site of a recent World War I battle, emphasizing both the spot's natural beauty and the devastation of the lives that were lost there, by bringing together two seemingly opposite interpretations of the same place. The speakers illustrate how life and death are always in balance with each other, even in tragic situations. Additionally, the speakers suggest that the steady cycles of the natural world reflect this balance and provide a way for humans to come to terms with tragedy and death. Death is a vividly present force throughout the poem. The speaker immediately describes the fields of Flanders, Belgium, as covered in crosses marking the graves of soldiers buried there, an image which emphasizes how deeply death has marked the spot. At the end of the first stanza, the mention of the guns below takes this initial impression further, indicating that the deadly conflict taking place in the fields is ongoing. The second stanza reveals that the speaker is, in fact, the dead. That is, the speaker, using the first person plural voice of we, is actually a group of speakers, all of whom died in the same place. Furthermore, the second stanza makes it clear that these deaths were untimely and tragic. The phrase short days ago emphasizes how recently these deaths occurred, while the warm imagery of dawn, sunset, and love underscores just how much the speakers lost when they died. The sense of death without peace continues throughout the poem's final stanza with restless imagery such as failing hands and dead that shall not sleep. However, the speakers balance these impressions of tragedy with ones of beauty and calm by making frequent reference to the stable cycles of nature. Even in the first line, the poppies are the dominant image, intermingling with the crosses in the second line and creating a sense that something beautiful and alive has grown from the deaths described. Poppies have been used as a symbol of rest and death since antiquity. So the choice of these flowers in particular highlights the close link between life and death. They are vividly alive even as their presence hints at death. The larks and their singing also suggests that nature has a powerful life force that extends far beyond the tragedy of the battlefield. Note that the larks are in the sky, up high enough that their song is scarce heard amid the guns below. The second stanza also underscores that the balance of the natural world continues even in the face of human atrocity. The speaker's references to dawn and sunset remind the reader that even though the dead can no longer experience these wonders, the sun still continues to rise and set in an endless cycle. Even in the face of the restlessness of the dead who shall not sleep, the poppies still grow in the second to last line, an image that echoes the first line and emphasizes how beautiful natural forces such as the growth of flowers will always persist, even and perhaps especially in the face of death. While the speakers in no way deny the power of death, after all, they are themselves the dead. They ultimately make the point that death is only one necessary part of a larger cycle or system that is inherently balanced. Death may not be peaceful, but it is nonetheless natural, and the speakers suggest that by noticing the never-ending cycles of the natural world, readers can learn to appreciate the deep beauty and ongoing life that coexist even with tragic death. So I think after reading that, you can already see that this poem is totally shifting our focus. Whereas Wilfred Owen wanted us to look at the death, he wanted us to see how much devastation and suffering was caused by the war, and he wanted us to see that devastation and suffering as meaningless and completely unnecessary, something that we should not expect young men to go through, and the lie of heroism and glorious death in war. He wanted people to stop telling that lie. This poem is seemingly in agreement with the ideology that says you must, you should sacrifice your life for your country in this war. And the way in which it does that is by shifting our focus off of the suffering and shifting it onto the beauty of natural cycles of life and death, the bigger picture. So we're not looking at the soldiers as they're dying, as their feet are bloodshot, as they're being bombed with gas shells, as they're being shot with rifle fire. That none of that stuff is being focused on in this first stanza. Instead, we're looking at afterwards when this is quite a silent image initially. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row. So this is a very beautiful, peaceful image of after the war, after the death, okay, has taken place. So the focus is shifted off of the suffering onto the peace that comes afterwards. That mark our place. So here we have the multiple speakers, the soldiers who've already died, and in the sky, and then they shift the focus off of the soldiers again to go back onto the larks. Larks are, because they're birds that sing in the morning, they are symbols of hope, of a new day, of an optimistic outlook. And then again, this is reinforced with this still bravely singing, okay? So it's almost as if it's saying, well, we can't bravely sing anymore because we're dead, but look at these birds. They're still doing what they can to continue to spread the message of hope and bravery and heroism and glory. Okay, they're still bravely singing. So again, shifting the focus off of the soldiers and this experience of the soldiers themselves and onto the natural beauty of the surroundings and the hope and optimism of that is symbolized by natural beauty. They fly up in the sky, scarce heard amid the guns below. So what he's saying is that it's difficult when you're on the ground, obviously, to take note of the birds. So he is highlighting the presence of the birds almost as a way of cheering them on, to say, even though you can't hear the birds because you're on the ground and you're busy fighting and your life is in danger, they are still there and they're still bravely singing. So almost as if to say we all belong to the same kind of army and we're all in this together. And even though you're not immediately aware of the beauty of nature or able to appreciate it in the midst of battle, just so you know it is still there. Okay. He's almost offering a kind of like a mental rest, a mental resting place for a soldier to go when he is feeling exhausted and downtrodden after all of his fighting. It's definitely a very selective depiction of war here that John McCrae, or rather the speakers, are trying to suggest that you can make the suffering less by not looking at it, by looking at something else, something beautiful, and by reminding yourself that it is part of the natural cycle to die. Even though this war was not caused by nature, it wasn't part of the natural cycle. It was caused by human beings, and it had political intentions. The speakers are definitely trying to suggest that war is part of the natural cycle of life. He's also very conveniently not looking at the other soldiers on the other side, whereas Wilfred Owen's suggestions were much more that war, the part of the reason why the war is meaningless is because, you know, in another time, in another circumstance, the soldiers on the one side who are killing the soldiers on the other side, in other situation, they may very well have been friends. They're all human. They all have families who love them. They all have talents. And basically, there's very little difference between the German soldier on the one side and the English soldier on the other side. And why are you killing young men with whom you have no quarrel, when you could just as easily be them if you had randomly happened to be born in Germany instead of Britain? So that was Wilfred Owen's part of Wilfred Owen's message, is that the real enemy is not the people you're killing. The real enemy is the governments who put all young men in this situation in the first place. However, here there is no acknowledgement of the other side, the soldiers who are being killed on the other side, as anything more than just a nameless enemy. And so the cause is, it's taken for granted that the cause behind this war is natural and right. So there's very little introspection in this poem. Introspection means looking at oneself, looking at the inside the cause of the war. It's just taking for granted that the war is being fought for a good and a noble and a righteous and a glorious purpose. even though each side believes that it is right and good and noble and glorious. Okay, so the next theme we need to look at is war and responsibility, which is dealt with more in the last half of the poem. In Flanders Fields, it is written in the voice of a group of soldiers who have recently died in World War I battle. By speaking as a group and asking the readers to join in their struggle, these speakers suggest that the war is shared responsibility that affects everyone. Many critics read this poem as a straightforward romanticization of war, and for good reason, because I think it is romanticizing war. A group effort, the soldiers' sacrifice, but at the same time, it also indicates that the war is a destructive phenomenon that interrupts the natural order of things. Ultimately, the speakers do not resolve the question of what exactly their struggle is. You see, they don't even look at it. Readers are left to decide whether the speakers are asking them to join the war or to work to stop it. But I do think that it's much more, it's very vague. And so, because it's so vague, I don't think that the message is an anti-war message at all, because it would have to be a lot more clear in order to be an anti-war message. And also, it doesn't say who exactly the foe is, but I think it's more likely that the foe is the expected opposing side in the war. So the dead are saying, you need to carry on the fight. In other words, here we're in a relay and we've just passed the baton on to you because we can't go any further, and now it's your turn to do the fighting and to take up the fight, take up the war against the enemy. And the speaker hasn't given us any reason to believe that the enemy is any other person other than the actual enemy that was being fought by Britain in World War I. So the speakers, who collectively call themselves the dead, begin by describing their circumstances to the reader. The second stanza in particular contains vivid descriptions of what the speakers have sacrificed in the name of war. It doesn't contain, like Wilfred Owen's poems, vivid descriptions of how they actually died, how they were in danger, how they physically were wounded and traumatized, and how their minds were damaged forever afterwards, even if they survived. It's got none of that. All it's talking about is what happened before and after they died. So here, there are vivid descriptions of what they sacrificed or what they left behind, which is the sunrises, the sunsets, and their loved ones. So they sacrificed all of the things that were valuable to them in order to fight and die in this war. And it's basically like a bit of a guilt trip here for the reader to say, well, if we agreed to make this sacrifice, then you should too. Okay, it's definitely trying to express an expectation of the reader to support the same cause that these soldiers fought and died for. I also just want to say here that I feel like it is incredibly presumptuous of the poet to claim to speak for the dead. He doesn't know what the dead experienced. He doesn't know whether or not they would have put forward this message. And so it's very, I find, brazen to take on the voice of the dead as if you speak for the dead, because there's ignorance in the living. Anyone who is still living cannot know what the dead have suffered and therefore cannot claim to speak for the dead. So I feel like it is very arrogant of the poet to take on the voice of the dead in a way, and also very, very manipulative. to take on the voice of the dead in an attempt to guilt trip the living, the readers of this poem, into carrying on the fight and continuing the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. By bringing the reader into their personal experience in this way, the speakers create a sense that war is a communal effort, and that everyone in a society at war shares the soldier's fate in some sense, which is, of course, factually speaking, not true, because the people who stay at home and do other sorts of work don't get to see what the soldiers experienced at all, and so continue under the illusion that it is a communal, noble cause, when in fact their loved ones are busy dying in a very, very ignoble and unglorious way on the battlefield. The final stanza makes this point explicit as the speakers ask the reader to take up their quarrel with the foe. And actually, no, it's not an ask, it is a command. Take up the quarrel with the foe. It doesn't have a please in it. It's not saying, please, will you take up the quarrel with the foe? It is stating that it is a necessity. It is a must. And state that they shall not sleep if the reader does not carry on the fight that they began. Again, it seems crucially important to the speaker that the battle be waged by everyone and not just the soldiers. Okay, so again, this is a very, very strong manipulative, guilt-trippy, propagandistic message to say our deaths are meaningless if you don't continue the fight and sacrifice your lives as well. And it's also saying that it's a threat. It's a veiled threat. It's saying if you don't continue the fight, we'll haunt you. We won't sleep. We'll be unsettled, unhappy ghosts who kind of float around the world because you are the ones who denied us a peaceful rest after our death. So it doesn't make that so clear in this analysis, but I definitely feel very strongly the manipulation that is happening in this poem. However, the speakers also depict war as horrific and senseless, even as they emphasize that everyone must share its burdens. In the first stanza, they make it clear that war overshadows everything, noting that even as birds continue to sing, larks still bravely singing, the noise of the guns below makes it hard for humans to access such beauty. The loss described in the second stanza can also be interpreted as a condemnation of war's senseless losses, although I don't get the sense from this poem that the speaker believes that the losses incurred by individual soldiers in this war are senseless, because if he did, then he wouldn't be asking more people to make the same sacrifices and endure the same losses. While the experiences that the speakers have lost may glorify their sacrifice, they also demonstrate how war rips humans away from the natural cycles of dawn and sunset, implying that war exists essentially outside of nature as a kind of abomination. Even the poem's meter breaks down at the words in Flanders fields. In lines 9 and 15, departing from the steady iambic tetrameter. So you guys know already what iambic pentameter is. It is 5 iambs per line. So it would have been 1 extra iamb if it were pentameter, but tetrameter means there are 4 iambs per line. So in Flanders fields, the poppies blow. So in Flan is 1 iamb, des fields is another iamb, the pop is another iamb, piece blow is another iamb. So there are 4 iambs, and it's a very regular kind of, just like soldiers marching to the beat of the drum, doing what they're supposed to be doing. That is a very, very regular rhythm that the poet has chosen, and we can understand why, because his message is very uh, typical of a pro-war voice, message, ideology. So, but the meter does break down with the words "in Flanders fields" in lines 9 and 15. Let's look at line 9, "in Flanders fields," because it's incomplete. Okay, in Flanders fields there are only two iams, and so it's almost as if the speaker is implying that more needs to be done here, and it's up to the reader to fill those gaps that are left by the dead. So you don't necessarily need to interpret the breakdown of the regular iambic tetrameter here as implying that war is wrong. Rather, it could also imply that more needs to be done, and it puts more of a responsibility on the soldiers of the living, the readers of the poem. In the light of the second interpretation, the speaker's request in the final stanza seems very different. Again, it's not a request, it's a command. If the speakers are actually trying to convince readers that war is an atrocity, then the responsibility symbolized by the torch might be more complicated than simply continuing to fight the same battles. Perhaps the metaphorical torch is actually the speaker's attempt to shed some light on the horrors of war. However, I disagree with this interpretation. And the reason why I disagree with this interpretation is because if the speakers really wanted to shed some light on the horrors of war, then those horrors would be more readily, openly, honestly, and vividly described in this poem. But instead of that, the only images of war we get to see are images of beautiful fields filled with poppies and peaceful crosses in the fields, suggesting that the dead are sleeping peacefully, but they've now got this peace. Now the world is left in a kind of a peaceful atmosphere, and the guns below are only very, very briefly mentioned. So I don't feel like it is a likely interpretation to say that this poem may be trying to shed some light on the horrors of war, because I feel if he did want to shed some light on the horrors of war, he would have done it a lot more directly and less evasively and subtly. And perhaps opposing the foe means putting a stop to the tragic losses like the ones the speakers suffered. The speakers leave this question open. It's ultimately uncertain whether they want the reader to fight for the war or against it. But the one thing they do make clear is that the reader has a responsibility to decide. The call to hold the torch high demands that the readers recognize their own complicity and responsibility in war, no matter which interpretation of the speaker's quarrel they choose. Okay, so you can decide. I mean, I've made it clear to you guys which interpretation I prefer, and that is that this is a very pro-war, very propagandistic poem, trying in very unsubtle and quite presumptuous and arrogant ways to convince the readers to support the cause of the war and to continue to tell the old lie that it is right and noble and glorious to die for your country. In the opposite way, working in the opposite way from Wilfred Owen's poem. However, you don't have to take that interpretation. You can take the interpretation that says that the quarrel with our foe is not necessarily the enemy, the Germans, that was being fought in World War I, and the quarrel is not necessarily the same battle that the soldiers died in, but rather another battle to stop the war, which means that if you take that interpretation, then you would see this poem as in more agreement with Wilfred Owens, just spreading the message in a lot less graphic and gritty and vivid, unashamedly gruesome way as Wilfred Owens. So you can absolutely take that interpretation. Okay, that's the end of this video, this first video on Flanders Fields, everybody. The next video on Flanders Fields will go through a line-by-line analysis. Have a good day.